thank you, David, for your time, for having
You're
us here. So our questions are, looking at the legacy of partition, what do you think has been the successes and failures of Northern Ireland?
Well, I suppose at the very basic level, the big success of Northern Ireland was to survive. There was a number of factors at the very start. There was a physical campaign, a violence campaign against the new state, effectively by the IRA at that time. So there was a lot of attacks, not only in Belfast, though it was most prominent in Belfast, but right across the countryside and so forth. So that was a big threat. And then there was a sort of internal threat as well, that nationalists refused to recognise the Parliament, they refused to recognise councils. Some councils had to be suspended and taken over by commissioners because they refused to recognise that Northern Ireland existed and so on. And some teachers, for example, Catholic teachers, refused to recognise the Northern government, and they were paid for a time from Dublin. So there was a combination of those things, that there was this political campaign, if you like, against Northern Ireland, and then there was a more physical campaign against it. So the early years were difficult years. The early 1920s were really difficult times, very, very troubled times. A lot of people were killed. There's a lot of sectarian violence on both sides, particularly in Belfast. And so I think that to survive through that was an achievement. And James Craig was the first Prime Minister, and he had a very difficult task in those early years to make sure that the state survived, because obviously it was new, and I think the view of sort of Republicans was that there wasn't any real stability to it. It hadn't, foundationed itself in effectively, and that if you could destabilise things to the extent, then it wouldn't succeed. And from political nationalism's point of view, they believed that there was a boundary commission was set up, and that it would report and make Northern Ireland much smaller, because there would be areas that would be transferred to the Irish Free State, and then Northern Ireland would become too small to be sustainable, so it would eventually then have to sort of come in under Dublin rule. So there were all those things at the time were very, very difficult. So I think that was a big success to actually survive and to prevent really a civil war, which is what the security system did at the time. There was a special constabulary founded at that stage that they called the Ulster Special Constabulary, and particularly the B Special Constabulary, who were part-timers, knew areas very, very well, so they would have known who might be involved in terrorism or violence, and all of that. Now they got a bad press then over the years, but it's still very much an important part, I think, of Northern Ireland. Had that not been there for stability, then things could have been a lot worse than what did happen, and it was bad enough what did happen. So I think that's a success, that it survived to enable itself to progress on. Failure, I think one of the failures in a longer term then was that we came out of that early period and we moved on, and the great unionist leader Sir Edward Carson was very concerned whenever partition was coming about, and he gave advice to unionists. He said that they must ensure that a situation didn't develop that they had warned about in the context of unionists being a minority. And he said that they needed to effectively they needed to reach out to the people who were the best of their opponents, and make sure that they tried to bring everybody together. And I don't think that happened as it should have done or could have done in the longer term. I think you had that early period in the 20s where it wasn't going to be possible, but unionists perhaps could have outreached a bit more, and it would have been difficult, but I do think there was a segment of particularly the Catholic and the nationalist population that they could have reached out to, and things might have changed and been a bit different over the years. Particularly in the period from around the Second World War, when there was very much a common bond,
Absolutely.
And that there's a realisation that people from both communities fought against a common enemy then in terms of fascism and so on. So I think that perhaps was an opportunity that was missed. But it's easy in hindsight to say they should have done this or they should have done that. It's always difficult to the fore and people, how they react. And it's very difficult to make the first move, I think, sometimes. And so what happened was they became entrenched. Protestants and Catholics became entrenched in their own communities, effectively. And there maybe wasn't the crossover that could have made things a bit better. And I think one of the failures probably was in the education system from the very start. In the very beginning, Lord Londonderry, who was Education Minister, had put forward proposals which would have made for a much more integrated system for students. But the Catholic Church wasn't happy with that because it wanted to control its own schools. And the Orange Order on the other side wasn't happy either because they were concerned about what this would mean.
Of course.
So I think that was a mistake, because I think that we see nowadays, I mean, there's an integrated education system now which is quite strong, but there's a state system and there's a church system effectively still in education. And I think that it should have been possible to try and retain the best of those, and certainly the Catholic Church are entitled to want to pass on the Church's teachings, but I think that could still have been done in a system that meant that the education system brought all people, all children together. I know when I went to school, usually a clergyman would have come in to speak to the children, and what would have happened would have been that people were Presbyterian, the Presbyterian minister came to them, the Church of Ireland minister came to the Church of Ireland people. So it's possible to do those sort of things, and I think that was a failure at the time, and sort of loud voices were raised against Lord Londonderry's proposal, and it was shelved in those early years. So that's something I think could have been quite pivotal.
How has partition shaped the two main communities here?
I think partition really came about because of a lack of understanding and ability by politicians to carry on the way we were. So there was no accommodation in terms of nationalism and unionism, and the end result was that 3/4 of the island of Ireland decided to become the Irish Free State, and 1/4 of it became Northern Ireland. So it was a failure of politics, which was brought about by a situation where you had two very different communities, and they had different outlooks, and they could not bring those outlooks together to a point where they were dovetailing in. So for me, partition was, a lot of people sort of talk about partition in the context of it was terrible, it divided the island and all the rest of it. But the reality was that partition was already there. It didn't come about in 1920. Right. It was already there. It was there long before 1920 in people's minds and their hearts. And those that were unionists were, generally speaking, were Protestant, and they were very fearful of what Home Rule would mean for them as a religious minority in an Ireland that would be dominated by their own Catholic Church. So that was their view from before the Government of Ireland Act, from before Northern Ireland was created, and it tells us a lot about why partition came about. The border wasn't drawn on a map; it was already there in people's minds. So I think partition for both those communities was the outworkings of a lack of sort of understanding of each other, a lack maybe of appreciation of the finer points of the different communities. And I don't think, from my point of view, looking at it historically, I don't think nationalism actually understood that very well or tried to deal with that very well. And I mean, William Smith O'Brien, who was a young Irelander leader in the 19th century and still a prominent nationalist politician in the early 20th, he said that nationalists really should make any concession they needed to ensure that unionists came into a Home Rule Ireland. But the mainstream of nationalism didn't take that view, and they believed that once Home Rule was passed in London, then unionists would go along with it. And that wasn't at all realistic, and it was fed by the fact that they didn't really know the psyche of Northern Protestants effectively at that time. So there was that lack of understanding. There was a lot of distrust between the communities, and that sort of became entrenched in the new state. And I suppose, we were living together but living apart effectively. People lived in the same areas, but there was obviously things that they didn't do together. And the different churches, they had different festivals and events and all of that, and a different outlook effectively. So from the point of view of the Roman Catholic community, they tended to certainly focus on the church. That became a big thing for them. I think that was almost the state that they adhered to within the state effectively. But they also initially certainly looked very strongly to Dublin. Now I think as years went on and as generations changed, I think that became a little less as the time went on. And it's certainly always been an ambition or an expression of ambition that there would be a United Ireland. But I think now that we're 100 years down the line, that is much less than it would have been back in the 1920s. And I think that both communities have grown slightly differently. I think that nationalism has grown differently from Dublin. It's grown differently from the Republic of Ireland. And people down in Dublin, I think, don't really have the same understanding of Ulster Catholics and nationalists that people may assume they had. And to be honest, some people have expressed the view to me that they're all troublemakers up there. So it was an easy way to pass it all off.
Yes,
but I do think that in terms of Catholics in Northern Ireland, they have had a different experience. They have had the experience from 1945-46 of the welfare system in the UK, the health system, all of that, and that's a very different experience than would have happened in the Irish Republic. And I think Protestants and Unionists have also had a different experience, because this establishment of Northern Ireland was really a halfway house. And when it happened, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, hoped that the two parts of Ireland would come together. And they created a Council of Ireland to try and encourage that along. The Council of Ireland never met, so it was never tested whether that would happen or not. But Unionists were they were part of the United Kingdom, but they were separate from it as well. So they had their own parliament, and they were the only part of the United Kingdom at that time that had its own parliament like that. And they were a sort of a place apart, I think. They were sort of the political establishment in London didn't really concern itself too much with Northern Ireland after 1920, until the Troubles came along in the 60s, and then suddenly there was a panicked response to what was going on. So I think that Unionists from Partition, they developed quite a strong self-reliance and an independence, effectively, in terms of their outlook and their psyche, than if they had just been part of the United Kingdom without their own parliament. So they developed differently, and nationalists developed differently too. So I think there was this really interesting strand between those two communities, that they still had their allegiances to different areas, but it's a questionable thing whether either of those two areas had felt the same allegiance to them, either of them. And I'm not convinced that in Dublin there's the same strong sense of allegiance towards the nationalists, and certainly in London there's not the same strong sense of allegiance towards Unionists.
Yes. Looking at decades of centenaries, how can they be explained and promoted to visitors and communities who do not see themselves as part of that past?
Well, I think, first of all, new communities like that bring fresh insights to situations, and that's a very good thing, because you can get, if you have a very binary situation, then people are very focused on their own interpretation, and they don't listen to the other person. Whereas if you get somebody who comes in new and comes with a fresh opinion, then that's different, and they may listen to that much more. So I think there's an element that there's something that new ethnic groups can contribute to Northern Ireland, first of all. But I think in terms of how they relate, or how they understand or engage with the history that we've had. I mean, this is, we tend to think that it's very unique, that we're a very unique place and nothing has ever happened anywhere else but here. But there's been, of course, there's been divisions in Europe, there's been divisions elsewhere. You've had partition, India and Pakistan. You've had situations in Europe after the First World War, like Silesia and Alsace-Lorraine, where there were plebiscites held as to where people wanted to belong to and so on. So these are not unusual things, but the way that we dealt with them probably is slightly different than the way we were dealt with elsewhere. So I think that people can understand situations. I think the most important thing really is to try and understand, first of all, where we've come from, but also understand where we can go to from that. So it's important to understand the basis for that. And that's what I always say in terms of Carson, who was the great leader of the Unionists. And Carson wanted them to try and bring everybody, the best of everybody together to build for the future. And that's what I would say, that the foundations of Northern Ireland were laid in 1920. But you build on foundations. The foundations are not the walls being up and the roof on the building and all of that. They're just the foundations. And as we go into the future then, that's when the construction happens. So I think that there's a strong importance in understanding what has happened, what opinions people have, what expressions of their identity they have, and for people from outside to try and sort of appreciate and have an understanding of that is important. And for everybody else, I think it's very good that we get all these other different groups coming in, because they bring in their own identities and their own culture, and maybe that can help us to appreciate everybody's culture much more than if there's just the two communities. So I think that's a big part of it. And I mean, that decade of the centenaries is significant. It lays the foundations for modern Ireland, for Northern Ireland, and for the Republic of Ireland as it becomes. So it's important to have a sense of all of that and to understand that. And people have come here for different reasons. A lot of them, I think, have come here to live here, to settle here, and to make it their home. So it's good that they know the background to it all, and it's good that they can have an input then into where we go into the future as well.
Thank you. And what is the experience of, if you can say a few words, of the Protestant community North and South, and how has it been solidified since the partition?
Well, the Protestant community, the majority of Protestants would have been in the 9 counties of Ulster. Certainly been very strong Presbyterian settlement in those areas. And in the other parts of Ireland then, Protestants tended to be quite scattered. They were there was quite a number of them, but they weren't as concentrated, other than in a few places, maybe around Cork and Bandon and places like that. So the experience of partition for Protestants overall was not good. You had the run-up to partition, you had the what's called the War of Independence, or the Anglo-Irish War. You had a civil war then as well in the Irish Free State. And Protestants tended to be largely the outsiders in those scenarios. Right. So during the period of the War of Independence, Protestants were viewed with a lot of suspicion by the IRA and were sometimes labelled as spies. Some of them were shot in the context that they were spies and they had passed on information to the military. A lot of them, of course, had sons or brothers or husbands who were serving in the First World War. So that's an important context of it too. And what happened, of course, was that a lot of them never came back. So the Protestant community became, after partition, particularly in the Irish Free State, it became particularly isolated. It was seen as a community that had a different objective, effectively. Some of them were accused of being spies, and there were lots of petty jealousies around, particularly in terms of the land and farms. You find that, and there's a lot of really nasty things go on for the community there. A lot of them decide to leave the Irish Free State, so about 42,000 people leave. Most of those are Protestants. Right. Now, some of them would be civil servants and in the police.
Where do they go?
Well, they go to different places. A lot of them go elsewhere within what is now the British Commonwealth, but the British Empire. So a lot of them go to Australia or Canada.
Right.
But quite a lot of them come into Northern Ireland and settle in Northern Ireland. And sometimes families are on both sides of the border. There's a family I know of in this area, and one son stayed on the farm in County Monaghan, but all the others came into Northern Ireland and ran businesses and so on successfully of their own. So that experience, I think it's hard to sort of try to understand, but you can see it when you look at the modern world and things that are happening in the modern world. You can understand communities suddenly feeling that they're isolated. And so that Protestant community in the 26 counties of Ireland felt very isolated. So they would have kept their heads down, those that stayed, but a lot of them didn't stay, a lot of them left. The people that stayed retained a culture, what I would call a unionist culture. They were cultural unionists, so, and they still would, a lot of their families still would be, so they would still have involvement in things like the Loyal Orders, the Orange Order and the Black Institution and so on. They would still respect the monarchy and so forth, and they would still have a strong sense of a British identity. Right. So that is an important part of it for them. But I think that what did happen was this feeling of loss and isolation. Right. Because they had backed the Unionist cause, they'd wanted to stay part of the United Kingdom. That hadn't worked out. There had been some very vicious things happen during those wars to them and the people they knew. And those in the three counties, particularly of Monaghan, Cavan and Donegal, had a particularly bad experience, because their experience was also tied up with the fact that they allied themselves to Unionists in Ulster. They had signed a declaration called the Ulster Covenant in 1912, and that pledged them to stand together throughout a time of threatened calamity, as I put it. So they had done that. They had formed the Ulster Volunteers, which was effectively a Unionist army intended to try and control as much of Ulster as they could if Home Rule passed. And they had gone over the parapet, if you like, over those things. So then the whole issue over Home Rule developed into a debate about how big the excluded area would be from Home Rule. Would it be 6 counties or 9 or 4 or what it would be? And the decision was taken then, majority decision by the Ulster Unionist Council, that it would be 6 counties. And that meant 3 counties were abandoned effectively, and they certainly felt abandoned. Right. There's no doubt about that. So it was a very difficult decision that Unionists in the other counties had to make, and they believed demographically that it was the right decision, that within a few years the demographics would mean that there could be a vote for a Dublin Parliament within that territory, and it would all be lost. So they took that decision to go for 6 counties. So those Unionists in those 3 counties really felt totally abandoned. And betrayed. And betrayed, yes. And it took a long, long time for that to fade. It was very noticeable in the 50th anniversary of the Ulster Covenant that the Orange Lodges from Donegal, Cavan and Monaghan were invited to come to Belfast for the big parade, and none of them came. They boycotted it because they said there was nothing to celebrate. And they talked about a broken covenant. Now, things have faded a bit now in terms of it all, but the reality is now effectively that Unionist community is still a Protestant community, still exists and survives, but there would certainly in a very real sense, people in certainly some of those border areas would have not wanted to say what their background was if they were asked. I know some of them told me in the past they came from a particular area which was a very Protestant community, and when they went into the towns around it, they would never say they came from there, because that would have identified them immediately as Protestant. Right. So they would say they came from a big town nearby, so where it was mixed. So that gives you an example of how the impact on those people. And of course, this was the big issue at the start of all of this campaign about Home Rule that led to Northern Ireland, was that Home Rule was Rome Rule was the slogan that they would use. Yes. Officially it wasn't. Whenever the Irish Free State was set up, officially that wasn't the case, and there was deliberate attempt to bring Protestants into the Senate, which would be the higher house of the Parliament. But the realities on the ground were quite different. And I mean, there was a very famous case in 1952 at a place called Fethard-on-Sea in County Wexford, where because a mother had refused to send her child to the Catholic school, there was a boycott of Protestant shops because it was a mixed marriage in the town. And it went on, it was quite a famous incident that went on. Now, Eamon de Valera, who was the president, he sort of said this wasn't the way we should be carrying on effectively. But it showed there was a difference between what officially, what people wanted it to be officially. and clearly the state didn't want to have this sort of sectarian aspect. Clearly the state itself didn't want to institutionalise sectarianism, but it did have a special place, for the Catholic Church in the Constitution, in 1937 Constitution. And on the ground, people reacted individually. And so that it didn't matter whether the state didn't approve of it or not. From the Protestants' point of view, it was what was happening to them that mattered. So that's their experience. In terms of northern Protestants, the experience was obviously very different because they were in a majority Protestant state.
Yes.
There would still have been, particularly in the border areas, there were families that were separated by the border. There were relatives on the other side of the border and so on. So it would have had a bit of an impact in relation to that. And I think the big impact probably was that a lot of those thousands of people who left the Irish Free State came into Northern Ireland, and they would have come in very, very embittered about what happened. They would have told stories about things that had happened to them and their communities in the Irish Free State, and that certainly would have added to Protestant views that they should not be anywhere near a united Ireland, effectively. And I think that's an important thing from that early 1920s period, that carries on in the psyche of Protestants then. And it feeds into everything generally. But I think that partition is cemented by the things that happen just immediately after it, and that's one of the things that happens from a Protestant perspective. So I think that they feel that they have done the right thing. They have stood firm for what they wanted, which was not to be part of Home Rule Parliament in Dublin. They got something they didn't want, which was a Parliament in Belfast, because they never asked for that, and they didn't really want it at the start. But as time went on, they believed that it was important that they had that. So I think that they developed quite significantly, almost separately in terms of the United Kingdom. And there's obviously lots of connections. Where you are today, there's very strong connections to Scotland. This is a Scottish community, effectively, from the 1600s.
And we are here in Ballycarry.
Yes, we're here in Ballycarry, so it's one of the early Scottish settlements, and the vast bulk of the families that were here, certainly until the past maybe, 50 years, would have been those Scottish families, and still it would be a large majority of people would have that background. So we're part of different, I suppose, satellites in many ways, but I think Protestants in Northern Ireland sort of vary between this looking as being part of the United Kingdom and being almost a separate sort of entity of their own, and you can trace that a lot in terms of how people describe themselves. And even today, people from the Protestant community, it's always interest to me in terms of flags, what flags people put out. So you will find a lot of people put out Union flags, but equally you'll find a lot of them putting out Northern Ireland flags, and that sort of it speaks of that sort of dual sense of identity, effectively. And I think there's a strong element of that, and some people have suggested it's more a working class, middle class divide in terms of how people align themselves. But there's certainly, over the years, there was at one stage there was talk about Northern Ireland having Dominion status and becoming a bit like Canada and so forth, and that never happened. But that was all there in the debate over the years within the Protestant community. So I think they are quite a complicated community. I think they have a lot of different layers of nationality to them and outlook to them as well, and that a lot of that is fed in with what happened after partition.
Thank you so much. It's absolutely fascinating.
You're welcome.
We've learned a lot. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you.